So, you mentioned at the top of the show that you did a deep dive 10-day thing into Linux.
Yes. So Windows is becoming more and more annoying. So,
True.
I mean, it keeps trying to get you to do things like subscribe to, uh, subscribe to Xbox Game Pass, and to buy more Microsoft services. It's getting very annoying and frustrating, and I would love to have an alternative. I'm not switching to Mac, so that leaves me with Linux. So I decided, hey, I'm going to see. It's been a few years since I last tried this exercise. I did try it a few years ago. What's it like to use Linux as my everyday operating system on both of my desktop and my laptop? Use it for work, use it for personal stuff. Just use it all the time. So I decided there's a lot of Linux flavors. I decided I would install the most popular one, which is Ubuntu, and I would install the latest version of Ubuntu, which is 2504, otherwise known as Plucky Puffin. Let me show you what Plucky Puffin looks like. So I'm going to share
I
my
pre-
screen here. This is
I appreciate that you said it a second time because I was going to make you say it a second time just to confirm that I had heard that correctly.
they're all the versions of Ubuntu are named after some kind of bird.
Sure.
Um, so this is Plucky Puffin, and you can see the wallpaper. Um, it uses the GNOME desktop environment, which is how you have this like left side sidebar here for which is both like a task, which is like a taskbar. The Instead of a start menu, you have this show apps menu that takes over your whole screen. And then if you install apps, they end up, this is a clean install that I put in a virtual machine. So right now you're just seeing all the apps there are, which aren't many, that it comes with. So although you can do an install where it installs recommended apps, then there's an app center, um, and you can go into the app center and you can find a lot of apps here. But one of the things that's interesting about Linux is that there's like half a dozen different ways to install apps, and depending on what app you want, it's you'll have to figure out how to install it. So, for example, I wanted to install Google Chrome as my browser. What happens if I search for Chrome? There's no Google Chrome. There's Chromium, which is the open source version. But what if I want the actual Google version that syncs with my Google account and is the same as I have on Windows? Well, for that, I have to go and download an app. So, you got to go find it, and there's like, you got to go to the download and you got to figure out where the package is. Now there's a package page. You want the DEB file. That's like getting an exe in Windows, I guess, or an MSI file, whatever. It's an installer. And now it tells me it's potentially unsafe because it came from a website rather than from the App Center. And now I can install it. So that's method two. Then the third method is what is using the command prompt using something called apt-get. So if I apt-get install, so I can use apt-get install. I'll use one of the things I had to install this way was FileZilla, which is my favorite FTP software, right? And then it asks you, do you want to install it? And you watch as it does this. And now FileZilla should be Google Chrome or on my app list, right? Um, but there are other types of apps that you have to compile the app. So you have to download the source code and compile it. And there are other ones that they use something called a Flatpak, which is another method of installing. So depending on what you want to do, there's a lot of different ways to install, and you have to find out what it is that you need to do. Oh, and there's also shell extensions. which are not installed by which are there's none installed by default. But if you install, I think it's GNOME Shell Extension Manager, um, it will allow you to go through a library there and try and find more apps that way, which are shell extensions. So there's a lot of ways to do this. Um, so that's not bad though, because that's flexibility. Uh, what I found is a lot of apps that I want to use are available. Slack is available. Discord is available. MySQL is available, but I think the best MySQL workbench I found was not actually made by the company that makes MySQL. Um, but then there are other things where, especially around hardware, where things are not available. There's no Logitech Options Plus to control your mouse or anything like that. I mean, I have a Logitech mouse, it works, but if I want to go into the advanced settings for it, there might be a third-party tool I can get to do it, but the original Logitech one is not available. Similarly, I have a Stream Deck Neo here that I love because allows me to create custom buttons for my favorite apps. There's a Elgato, also known as Corsair, does not make a Linux version of its software. So what to do? You have to download a third-party app called Stream Deck Controller, and that is not as good as the first-party one, but it works. But there's lots of pieces of hardware that are custom that don't work, or partially work, or they're control. There's not a version made for Linux. If you want Adobe apps, if you want Microsoft Office, not made. You can not made for Linux. You can use GIMP instead of Photoshop, but the UI is not as good. You can use LibreOffice instead of Microsoft Office, but doesn't have as many features. So even after being on the market 30 years, there's still a lot of lack of support. And the one that really bothered me the most, I have to say, is that I really like Auto Hotkey for Windows, which is a hotkey scripting, macro scripting language. And they don't make it for Ubuntu, but there is a third-party program called AHKX11 that's supposed to allow you to run auto hotkey scripts in Ubuntu, or not in Ubuntu, I'm sorry, in Linux, and it won't run in Ubuntu because Ubuntu is a newer window manager than it supports. So overall, Linux is usable, very usable. You can absolutely use it for your everyday tasks, especially if most of what you do revolves around the web. But you will find that there's just that small percentage of software that is not available. Like there's the leading 3D printer slicers not available for Linux. So, there's just a lot of stuff that's missing that you would want that I would want if I were to just throw Windows in the garbage can.
And it's interesting. So, from a hardware perspective, several of the things you just mentioned are sitting here next to me as well. I run the show off of a Stream Deck in here because I don't want the big board to take up that much space. So that would be a problem. I know that my switching software doesn't work. So this room's not an option. But then I do a lot of Microsoft development. So for me, it kind of would never work. But yeah, so I've done this experiment myself in the past and found a lot of the same annoyances that you called out. In particular, not being able to easily install software like that. Is it this one? or is it this one? Is and you know, sure, Microsoft has the Microsoft Store, but you know, even though I've built apps for it, I think we all know that's not the place that we get software for for Windows generally. So you know, you go to the browser, you search for your thing, you get an MSI or an exe, and you install and you move on. You don't generally have to compile things unless you're looking for something weird. But then you called out specifically the 3D slicers and stuff for 3D printing, where it feels like the overlap between the group that's big into Linux and the group that's big into 3D printing would have, like, that Venn diagram would have a bigger overlap than than it appears, at least based on support. So it might
Right.
it might legitimately just be that nobody cares about supporting it.
Right. I mean, I think that's it, right? Oh no, wait. Maybe some things will be supported. So supposedly right now, I haven't tried this. There is a version of Prusa Slicer for Linux.
Okay,
So and that's a good one. So maybe I could try that. Um, so it's not universal that things aren't supported, but
sure,
you really have to check. You really have to check because a lot of companies don't feel like they need to offer Linux support. Um,
sure.
like there's no version of Google Drive for Linux,
Hmm.
right? You can't install the Google Drive client. You can't install. I mean, you can use in your browser, but you can't install the client. But Dropbox is there. You can get Dropbox for Linux. So
Interesting. Considering that Chrome OS is a Linux derivative, that means they've already got code. They just don't want to. Okay,
yeah,
doesn't matter.
yeah. Now, what I find really interesting though is a few weeks ago I was, um, I was talking to some folks at Qualcomm, and they were talking about how Qualcomm has so much app support. Like there's just so much. So within, I mean, Windows on ARM has become big enough that it's something like 10% of the laptops over $800 that were sold. I think some really strong percentage of laptops that were sold uh, over a certain price were were sold with Qualcomm inside, which means they run Windows on ARM. And it used to be that there were compatibility issues with Windows on ARM, but now, I mean, I wouldn't use it for gaming, but now, like, there's versions of almost everything for Windows on ARM, but native versions. And Windows on ARM, while it's had a few years to develop, it really became only started to become big last year. And Microsoft, I guess, has done a good job of pushing developers to come out with Windows on ARM versions of their software. Whereas Linux has only been around for like what, 25, 30 years, and they can't get a company like Logitech to support Linux with their software.
An interesting point.
They can't get Razer to make a version of the Razer software for Linux, right?
Which
They
is another
can't get
company, which Logitech and Razer are both other companies that I feel like that Venn diagram would be more this than this. You know what I mean?
right. I mean, I guess they figure people aren't gaming under Linux, but I mean, you do have, but I don't know about that because
Steam
look at
OS.
Steam OS, which is a variant of Linux, right?
Yeah.
So they really, I mean, they're just not really showing any interest in Corsair, which is owns Elgato, not making their software for Linux. Like, I don't know how difficult it is to port your software to Linux. I bet it's more work. I guarantee it's more work than recompiling it for ARM for Windows on ARM, because
Mm-hmm.
you can take the same software and just recompile it for Windows on ARM, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, it's a shame that they really don't take Linux seriously as an operating system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's hurting adoption of Linux more than anything else, is that there's, I mean, I don't know if it's more than anything else, but you have to worry about, oh, is there this app that I want, or this piece of hardware that I want, that, like, maybe it'll work. Like my Logitech MX Master 3S mouse works. It'll work, but if I want to go and change the DPI on it to 8,000 DPI, which it's capable of, I can't. If I want to change what the buttons do, I can't. So, I think it's frustrating that so much exists for Windows and it doesn't exist for Linux, and so you still have to make choices and sacrifices. If your app works, it generally works pretty well. Like the Slack app works pretty well. Um, One thing I did discover is I don't really like the UI in that GNOME UI that I showed in Ubuntu. And what I recommend is people install Kubuntu, Kubunt, Kubunt, uh, which is the version with KDE. It looks a lot like Windows 7. It has a very Windows taskbar and start menu, um, and I like, and it seems to have a better screenshot app built in and other better things built in. So I would recommend, if you're going with the flavor of Linux, to go with Kubuntu over Ubuntu. But I mean, it's really workable, and I think I would recommend it for. I mean, I think people may get thrown off though, but I would recommend it for like PC refurbishers and charities that are trying to take older PCs, and by older I mean older than Windows 11 compatible, take those and install Linux on them. Some people like Linux Mint for this, but whether it's Mint or it's Kubuntu, install one of those on there. Don't try to put Windows 10 on a PC that you're giving somebody for charity. Don't try to like get around the Windows 11 requirements. Um, so I think there's I think there's a lot of good use cases for Linux, because it's free, because it's open, because it runs on older hardware, and it's not bad for running under your best hardware, but um, you're not going to be able to run everything, and that is a real downer.
Yeah, for sure. But there could be alternatives if you're dealing with a charity PC or something like that. At least you can get things up and running, and the promise of Lindos has never come to pass. Uh, who remembers that one? That was fun to follow. Anyway, if I'm not mistaken, Abram, you did a whole like
Yes,
blog on what was
so
going
come
on.
to come to Tom's Hardware and look for my week with Linux, which actually was more like my 2 weeks with Linux. And you can read all about my experiences with it. We have a lot of Linux tutorials to help people get started, and it's definitely worth trying if you want to. If you have the time and energy to give it a shot, you can easily dual boot it with Windows, which is what I did.
Gotcha. Yeah, with the subsystem for Linux, you can even run it in Windows if you just want to give it a try.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good for running something within Windows to run the command prompt. You can run some of the GUI apps with WSL, but it just doesn't feel like you're not getting the full Linux feel. You would be
Gotcha.
better with a virtual machine, I think, for that. But but WSL is good for, like, I've used it for doing things that involve like a lot of Python scripts that are made for AI are merely made to run under Linux and not made to run under Windows. And
Got
so
it.
WSL is much better for that.
Makes sense. Well, Avram, as always, definitely appreciate it. That's I have not run this experiment myself in a very long time, and maybe maybe it's time to go do it again. And as always, I look forward to what we talk about next time.